Welcome everyone. Welcome to the session of Dualities, the Marriage of Opposites. I'm James P. Barbieri, Associate Program Director here at the Fire Center, and I'll be your host for today. So any problems, please do let me know in the chat. Before we open this session, I'd just like to invite you all to take a moment of silence together to reflect on the events that are happening here in Europe, and for all those people that are suffering from these events. Thank you all for joining me in this silence, and of course our thoughts go to all these people. The second thing I wanted to let you all know before we begin this session is that I know many of you have been asking about the recordings for this session. I do have to apologize for this. There has been a delay due to technical difficulties, but we are working towards fixing them and getting those recordings to you. Now, to start the session, today we have the honor to be joined by Mark Saban. Mark was for 20 years an actor and performer before training with the independent group of analytical psychologists, with whom he is a senior analyst. He's also a lecturer in Jungian and post-Jungian studies in the Department of Psychosocial and Psychoanalytic Studies at the University of Essex. Today, Mark will be talking to us about Jung's two personalities, psychological implications. Before we begin, I'd just like to very briefly go through the guidelines for this session. First of all, we invite you all to turn off your microphone to avoid any background noise, but at the same time, please do keep your camera on. Throughout the call, please do use the chat. It's a great way to share your ideas with the group, with all the topics that arise from this lecture. However, if you do find the chat distracting, you can use the chat button at the bottom of your screen to hide the chat. Finally, this session is recorded for archival purposes, and for you all, you will eventually get the recording. Again, apologies for the delays. So with that, I'll pass it over to you, Mark. A very warm welcome from us.
Thank you very much, James. Hi, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here and to talk to you today about Jung's two personalities. Is there anything I need to say about myself? I don't think so. Yeah, I mean, in terms of the chat, please, second James, please feel free to put any comments or questions in the chat, and hopefully we'll get the chance to take a look at them later in the session and have good time to have a good amount of time to talk to each other and thrash out some of this stuff, because I'm really interested to hear what you make of anything that I've said. I think I'll share my screen. I've got some slides to let's have a look. Yeah, there we go. Okay, good. Now I'll get rid of my self view. Don't want to be distracted by that. Okay, good. So when I started to write the PhD thesis, in fact, on which I eventually based my book, Two Souls, Alas. There we go. Two Souls, Alas, Jung's Two Personalities and the Making of Analytical Psychology, which came out in 2019. I thought at that stage that what I wanted to explore was what Jung frequently refers to in his writings as the problem of opposites. And that was because this seemed to me to be a topic which had never really received anything resembling a comprehensive treatment. So I set about it. I immediately dived into the intellectual history of the opposites. I looked at the opposites in linguistics. I looked at the opposites in logic. I researched the opposites in Heraclitus, in Plato, Neoplatonism, Meister Eckhart, Nicholas of Cusa, Giordano Bruno, and Jakob Böhmer. I pursued polarities in Goethe, Schelling, and in Hegel, and in Nietzsche. I even began to dabble in quantum physics. All of these, I've no doubt, are areas that you all know intimately. But anyway, these lines of inquiry are clearly relevant to the investigation of dualities. But nonetheless, at this point, having written more than 10,000 words on all this, I stopped because I really felt dissatisfied with the whole approach. Now, I am by profession a practicing psychoanalyst, as was Jung. I'm not a philosopher or a nuclear scientist or linguist or whatever, and nor was he. So what I was reminded of at this point was something that Jung emphasizes again and again, and that is the importance of grounding ideas in experience. So all this highly speculative and metaphysical stuff that I began to explore basically felt too distant from that experiential dimension. And so I started again. And this time I began with Jung's own experiences as he described them in old age, looking back at his childhood in his memoir, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, which I'll refer to as MDR for the rest of the talk. So today, what I want to start with is what I discovered when I approached things from this angle. So early on in MDR, Jung comes out with this striking comment. He says, somewhere deep in the background, I always knew I was two persons. And he goes on to tell us that he came to the conclusion as a child that he had what he calls two personalities, which he imaginatively describes as personality number one and personality number two. And he's very, very keen throughout the book to make it clear that he absolutely refuses to, as it were, retrospectively pathologize himself. He says the conflict between the personalities has nothing to do with a split or dissociation in the ordinary medical sense. On the contrary, it is played out in every individual. So basically, Jung is telling us that this possession of two personalities wasn't merely either a quirk of his own psychological development. He wasn't mad. He wasn't suffering from multiple personality disorder. On the contrary, for Jung, this inner division represented a fundamental dynamic of human psychology, active, so he says, within the psyche of every human being, which is quite a claim, I think. Now, he observed this idea of two personalities, first of all, in his mother. He says there was an enormous difference between my mother's two personalities. By day, she was a loving mother, but at night, she seemed uncanny. Then she was like one of those seers who was at the same time a strange animal, like a priestess in a bear's cave, archaic and ruthless as truth and nature. At such moments, she was the embodiment of what I have called the natural mind. So Emily Jung's two personalities seem to have been radically different and mutually exclusive. And Jung makes it clear that he had felt it was wrong to draw attention to this difference when speaking to her because she would only deny it. Her personality number two was, as he describes it, an unconscious personality. Her personality number one, in other words, didn't know about the other personality. And when she occupied her personality number one, Emily Jung was, he says, a kindly, fat, old woman, extremely hospitable, and the possessor of a great sense of humor. But this was in extreme contrast with her number two personality, which was, as he says, uncanny, archaic, ruthless, unexpected, and frightening. And she was either in one of these personalities or the other. There was apparently no relationship between the two. However, when it comes to Jung, this was a bit different. Now, I want to take a look at the qualities which come up in MDR when he's talking about the two personalities. So first of all, personality number one. So Jung's personality number one corresponds to his identity as a conventional, ordinary child, an adult. And in MDR, he associates personality number one with the familiar, the everyday, the reliable. As personality number one, Jung existed, he tells us, as merely a grubby, naughty, and lazy little schoolboy who deserved his punishment and who had to behave to his age. And in academic or intellectual terms, personality number one shows up in an attraction to facts, he says, concrete things, he describes them as, and empirical science. And it's worth mentioning, I think, that personality number two really was the dimension that involved Jung in the outer world, and particularly that of outer relationships, personal and collective, context of family, school, and work. However, personality number two, quite different. Now, in MDR, he talks about personality number two as being closely related to certain early experiences that he had. I won't go into detail with these, but one of them was that he had this amazing dream when he was very young of a giant phallus deep under the earth. This was extremely numinous to him and impressive. Later on, he used to sit on a certain stone in the garden, and he used to wonder if he was the sitter or whether he was the stone he was sitting on. That experience he associated with personality number two. He carved a little mannequin out of a ruler and hid it up in the attic, and all these experiences and objects were extremely secret. He uses this word secret a lot in MDR in these chapters, and he didn't tell anybody about any of this stuff, not until much later, and some of it not until he actually writes his autobiography, which of course is a posthumous autobiography. So in a way, he doesn't tell anyone until that point. But he makes it clear that this may have been secret, but it wasn't just the kind of secret that one kept, as it were. It was the kind of secret that could never really be revealed. What seems to have mattered is that they involved the child Jung in a realm of impenetrable mystery and unanswerable questions. And later on, when he gets older, he describes personality number two as related to what he calls God's world. And he doesn't mean the world of the Christian God, but something really to do with an experience of nature in a kind of wild and cosmic form. The earth, the sun, the moon, the weather, the night, dreams, all these are connected to personality number two. He says his number two personality knew God as a hidden, personal, and at the same time suprapersonal secret, the secret again. And later it brought with it a sense of timelessness, infinity, and the imperishable. Or as Jung puts it, superhuman dazzling light, the darkness of the abyss, the cold passivity of infinite space and time, the uncanny grotesqueness of the irrational world of chance. So clearly there's an enormous contrast between the ordinary world of personality number one and this personality. As you can see, the themes which come up are diverse, but they kind of make sense as a certain kind of world, I think. And later on, when Jung was at school, he started associating personality number two with what he calls the search for meaning. And not surprisingly, he associates that with philosophy, and especially the philosophy of Meister Eckhart, of Schopenhauer, Kant, and Nietzsche. Other personality number two interests include a romantic, nostalgic sense of history, Greco-Roman, Egyptian, prehistoric archaeology, and comparative religion. Again, in contrast with personality number one, personality number two was entirely focused on Jung's inner world, his inner life. It was invariably experienced when he was alone. And this meant it's almost completely unrelational, non-relational, except in a kind of intrapsychic sense. And in fact, Jung had enormous difficulty in the whole idea of communicating anything about this personality number 2 to anybody else. He struggled with this. It was very difficult for him because he wanted to, he didn't want to be stuck with it on his own, but he felt that he couldn't really express any of it. It was inexpressible in a sense. And also he felt that it would be a kind of betrayal somehow to do this, and it might even be very dangerous to him. So, in terms of the way in which Jung experienced these two personalities, from a very early age, Jung evidently found the outer world, the world of other people, much more challenging than he did his inner world. When he was at school, for example, with other children, his experience of inner division was exacerbated. The personality number 1 realm of outer relationship and sociality was, he says, it alienated me from myself. Oh yeah, that's a sort of map of the two personalities, so you can get the full kind of image of exactly how they contrast with each other and the differences between them. Yeah, I'm not sure there's much more to say about that. So yeah, Jung says that when he was with other children, he became different. He says, I became different from the way I was at home. It seemed to me that the change in myself was due to the influence of my schoolfellows who somehow misled me or compelled me to be different from what I thought I was. The influence of this wider world, this world which contained others besides my parents, seemed to me dubious, if not altogether suspect, and in some obscure way, hostile. So he's clearly drawn sort of more comfortable in a way at this early stage with personality number 2, much more than with personality number 1 in a sense. At a later point, he started suffering from fainting fits, which actually meant that he was allowed to stay away from school. And he then became completely absorbed in what he calls the mysterious realm of personality number 2. And he whiled away the hours, deep in nature, dreaming, walking, drawing, reading. But what happened was he overheard a conversation between his father and some friend, in which his father was recounting to this friend the crippling effect of Jung's illness and the effect it was having on his family. And Jung suddenly understood that it was going to be absolutely necessary for him to kind of re-enter the world as an active person. And at this point, Jung's sense of self makes a shift in the direction of personality number 1. And shortly afterwards, he describes an experience of having emerged, as he says, from a cloud. He says, I knew all at once, now I am myself. Previously, I had existed too, but everything had happened to me. Now I happened to myself. Now I knew. I am myself now. Now I exist. And you can see how he's hammering away at this word I here, which is clearly indicating a crucial sort of point in the development of his ego. Later on, Jung describes how number 2 personality became more and more doubtful and distasteful to me, and I could no longer hide this fact from myself. He says, I tried to extinguish number 2, but I couldn't succeed in that either. Jung he says, caught in an insoluble conflict. So he kind of veers in his early life between these two personalities, and whichever one he's in, he's not entirely comfortable. Somehow the conflict gets to him. But nonetheless, there were points, and gradually, in which Jung was able to get a glimpse of what it might be like to move beyond this conflict between these two personalities. So to illustrate that, I'm going to take a look at the way in which the teenage Jung started engaging with the notion of science. So as he describes it, he says, on the one hand, I was powerfully attracted by science with its truths based on facts, personality number 1. On the other hand, I was fascinated by everything to do with comparative religion. In science, I missed the factor of meaning, but in religion, that of empiricism. And elsewhere, he says, science met to a very large extent the needs of number 1 personality, whereas the humane or historical studies provided beneficial instruction for number 2. So he's aware of the difference, the way in which there are two kind of two realms here academically, and number one is drawn to one, number two drawn to the other. But he's left with this conflict. He doesn't really know whether he wants to go in the direction of science or whether he wants to go in the direction of the humanities. So when he's 19, he had a dream. In fact, he had two dreams close together. And in the first dream, Jung digs up the bones of prehistoric animals, and he thinks to himself, I must get to know nature, the world in which we live, and the things around us. And in the second dream, he comes upon this awe-inspiring image of a giant radiolarion deep in the forest, and he awakens with a beating heart. The image there in the middle is the sort of thing that I think this is from Haeckel, and it's an image of which I think is what he had in mind when he talks about this giant radiolarion. But anyway, the point is that as a result of these dreams, and of course it's extremely characteristic of Jung that he gains this insight via these dreams rather than a kind of daylight reflections. But anyway, he goes on to tell us that these two dreams decided me overwhelmingly in favor of science and removed all my doubts. But the question is, you know, what was it about these dreams which resolved this insoluble conflict? So it seems to me that they enabled Jung to achieve a novel and revelatory vision of science. It was a way of seeing which was transformative because it enabled Jung to partake in what I would call a binocularity. So on the one hand, or perhaps we should say through one lens, the dreams clearly endorse Jung's eminently intellectual impulse to discover, dig up the objective truth about nature. That's the number one side. But on the other, they keep fully alive the numinous affect. Jung wakes up with this beating heart, which is held by Jung's witnessing of this mysterious creature deep in the forest. So it kind of, in a way, the dreams bring the two together. And it was the stereoscopic binocularity of this novel perspective which enables Jung to transcend what he'd hitherto experienced as a kind of all or nothing, either or binary feeling of impossible and possibly painful contradiction. So this three-dimensional perspective which emerges is revolutionary for Jung precisely because it brings together these two dimensions that Jung had already identified to himself as radically incompatible, that of meaning on the one side and that of empirical fact on the other. And so it works to transcend these limited possibilities offered by each of the original single perspectives. Jung's newly transformed understanding and engagement with science also provides him with a renewed sense of certainty about his own scientific future. He realizes as a result of this, this is the way he wants to go. So even at this early stage in Jung's development, in Joe Cambray's words, the visionary and the scientific are already intertwined and mutually interacting. And the interesting bit is the way in which they mutually interact.
No sound.
Sorry, can you hear me? Can you hear me? You can hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay. Yeah, so where was it? Yeah. Now, staying with this theme, a comparable transformation, though one that took an interestingly different form, occurs when Jung was pondering his future specialty in medicine. So leafing through the preface to a psychiatric textbook by Krafft-Ebing, Jung was electrified by a passage about the necessarily subjective dimension of psychiatry. He says, my heart suddenly began to pound. I had to stand up and draw a deep breath. So what happens is that he realizes at this point, having read this passage in Krafft-Ebing, he realizes, as he says, that the two currents of my interest could flow together and in a united stream dig their own bed. Here was the empirical field common to biological and spiritual facts, which I had everywhere sought and nowhere found. Here at last was the place where the collision of nature and spirit became a reality. So it's a similar idea, I think, as we saw with the two dreams. And it's interesting that Jung uses this word, I mean, the German word is Zusammenstoß, which is translated here as collision. And what Jung's indicating is that what he's experiencing is not a kind of smooth process of synthesis, but a head-on clash, apparently between what are apparently incompatible opposites. And this gets expressed, first of all, in the form of the opposites biological, spiritual, and then later on as nature versus spirit. But Jung's excitement derives from his realization that his life as a psychiatrist would be spent exploring the realm in which these two incommensurate dimensions would collide in this way. However, in the subsequent passage in MDR, Jung indicates how complex this realization actually is by introducing a further problematic pair of conceptual opposites, objectivity and subjectivity. And again, Jung's affect is powerfully engaged. He experiences what he calls a violent reaction to reading this passage in Krafft-Ebing, which he paraphrases in this way. He says, this textbook is in part the subjective confession of the psychiatrist, who with his specific prejudice, with the totality of his being, stands behind the objectivity of his experiences and responds to the, quotes, disease of the personality, unquote, with the whole of his own personality. So the subtle and difficult encounter between subjectivity and objectivity, which Jung describes here as occurring within the work of psychiatry, was to persist as a central preoccupation for Jung, not only in terms of his own process, but also with regard to psychology itself. In other words, the psychiatrist's specific prejudice, as he calls it, in other words, his subjective approach, which Jung was later to describe in his own works as his personal equation, gets put into dynamic relation with the objectivity of his experiences, in other words, the scientific perspective. And again, it's precisely by bringing these two things together that Jung achieves, or thinks he's going to achieve, that binocular perspective, which is essential for what Jung describes here as a response by the whole personality. In other words, both dimensions in tension. So here in Jung's approach to science, we can see Jung bringing together two quite different oppositional pairings. First of all, we've got the biological and spiritual, and then we've got the subjective and the objective. Now, these pairings obviously completely different. They're talking about different things. But what that emphasizes is that the approach to duality that we find here in Jung, and generally in Jung's notion of individuation, which we'll go on to talk about, is not that certain particular opposites come into play, but rather the dynamic process by which opposites are brought into contact with each other. His point is that these dynamic tensions, precisely the tensions that we find or found between personality number one and personality number two in Jung's early years, constitute the primary motor within, in fact, as we'll see, every dimension of his psychology. Later on, at the end of his life, Jung offers a deceptively simple retrospective statement. He says, "My life is what I have done, my scientific work, the one is inseparable from the other." And in this cogent phrase, he's showing the inextricable intertwining, I think, of both subjective and objective dimensions, as they have showed up in his life or his science, and in his science or his life. And Jung's is suggesting that it's therefore an error to strictly differentiate and demarcate objective science from subjective life and put them into radically different discrete compartments. This insight, in fact, also highlights, I think, the vital importance of the relational aspect of Jung's psychology, because what really matters, he's implying here, is neither the science nor the life, but what happens in the relation between them. It's through this relation and other relations of this kind that this kind of three-dimensional binocularity that I've talked about can be achieved. So to go back to Jung's development, according to MDR, it was, again, as often with Jung, a dream which finally clarified for Jung the respective roles that his personalities number one and his personality number two were to play within his life. So the dream goes like this. He says, "It was night in some unknown place, and I was making slow and painful headway against the mighty wind. Dense fog was flying along everywhere. I had my hands cupped around a tiny light, which threatened to go out at any moment. Everything depended on my keeping this little light alive. Suddenly, I had the feeling that something was coming up behind me. I looked back and I saw a gigantic black figure following me. But at the same moment, I was conscious, in spite of my terror, that I must keep my little light going through night and wind, regardless of all dangers. And when I awoke, I realized at once that the figure was my own shadow on the swirling mists brought into being by the little light I was carrying. I knew too that this little light was my consciousness, the only light I have. My own understanding is the sole treasure I possess and the greatest, though infinitely small and fragile in comparison with the powers of darkness. It is still a light, my only light," Jung says. So this dream had a big effect on Jung, and he basically interpreted it as offering him a profound insight into how he henceforth needed to regard the roles of the two personalities, which had continued to plague him, the conflict between them, as his life continued. He says, "Now I knew that number one was the bearer of the light and that number two followed him like a shadow. In the role of number one, I had to go forward into study, money-making responsibilities, entanglements, confusions, errors, submissions, defeats. But I recognized clearly that my path had led irrevocably outward into the limitations and darkness of three-dimensionality." So the wider implication of the dream, I think, is that one-sidedness can show up either in the direction of personality number one or in the direction of personality number two. For the psyche, both kinds of one-sidedness are equally toxic because they both impede the relationship between the two personalities, and therefore the work of what Jung calls individuation itself. And I think it's highly significant that in the dream, personality number two is represented as the shadow of personality number one, which is an image that evokes a relationship of fundamental interdependence and complementarity. And in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung acknowledges this sense of interdependence between the two with this reflection. He says, I must leave number two behind me, that was clear, but under no circumstances ought I to deny him to myself or declare him invalid. That would have been a self-mutilation. So in terms of his own development, he's recognizing he needs to get on with life. He needs to get out there in the world. He needs to get a job. He needs to get married. He needs to, all the stuff, all the relational stuff, all the outer stuff needs to be done. All that is important. But he mustn't ever forget this other hugely important personality number two aspect, which will, of course, show up again and again in his later life. Now, I'm now going to talk a bit about, take a moment to drink some water. So I'm now going to go on and talk a little bit about the way in which these opposites, as Jung goes on to talk about them, show up in Jung's mature psychology as he goes on to develop it. I mean, he doesn't, in that psychology, refer back to his experiences with his two personalities. The only place in which he talks about that is in this later work, this final posthumous work, MDR. But it seems to me clear that that experience informs his later psychology in all kinds of ways. I'm not saying I'm reducing it to that. I'm not saying it's only about that, but it kind of gives him an in, I think, to understanding the opposites and the way in which the opposites work. And that enables him, having had this experience, that enables him to get to the heart of it in the psychology. So, yeah, I mean, Jung, everywhere you look in Jung's collected works, you find him talking about the importance of the opposites. For example, life is born only of the spark of opposites. Elsewhere, there can be no reality without polarity. This notion of polarity, very important to Jung as well, obviously related to the question of the opposites. Elsewhere, the psyche, like any other energetic system, is dependent on the tension of opposites. Another quote. He says, I see in all that happens the play of opposites and derive from this conception my idea of psychic energy. I hold that psychic energy involves the play of opposites in much the same way as physical energy involves a difference of potential. That's to say, the existence of opposites such as warm and cold, high and low, etc. So this notion of psychic energy, which is important to Jung, when he's talking about that, what he's talking about is basically what powers the psyche, what powers psychological life. And he's placing this idea in this particular essay he wrote. I think it was a newspaper article, actually, Freud and Jung. He's comparing his psychology to that of Freud. And his point is that Freud foregrounds a single drive, at this point anyway, in Freud's psychology, the single drive of sex. Or alternatively, if you're looking at Adler, it's power. But in both cases, it's a single drive. Whereas Jung is bringing in here this energy that comes from the play of opposites. It's never a single drive. There's always a duality involved. Now, he doesn't specify here which opposites he means. He leaves the question open. In other words, what matters is not which opposites are in play, but that some kind of opposition must be present, some kind of conflict, some kind of tension must be present in order to generate psychic energy. And he goes on to explicate this idea by drawing an analogy between the energy of the psyche and the energy in the form of heat flowing from a hot object to a cold one, or the potential energy discharged, the water at the top of a waterfall drops into a pool below, and so on, in the physical world. And in this case, these cases, no energy is generated if there's no difference of potential. Now, in a later work of Jung's, which is called On the Nature of the Psyche, which is from 1947, Jung uses as examples the opposites of spirit and instinct. So for Jung, the concept of instinct has a place within what are basically a constellation of related terms. There's body, there's matter, there's nature, there's physicality, sensuality, world, the outer world, in effect. And I think we can clearly align these with the realm that Jung experienced as personality number one. And these terms get routinely positioned by Jung in opposition to another set of terms, including spirit, spirituality, mind, psyche, the inner world, the intrapsychic world, which I think we can align more or less with Jung's personality number two. So these polarities also closely relate to the opposition that we saw earlier between subjective and objective. And Jung's emphasis upon all these oppositions and the project of transcending them, because as we'll see, that's the goal ultimately. If we're looking backward, clearly they echo all kinds of tropes that we might find, for example, in the literature of Romanticism or in German idealist philosophy. But also, if we look forward, we can see they also relate to the collaboration that Jung will engage in with Wolfgang Pauli, quantum physics, and also then the theories of synchronicity and Jung's notion of what he calls the unus mundus, the one world, which gets developed in his later psychology. So in this text, Jung is emphasizing an intimate complementary relationship between opposites. He says, between all opposites, there obtains so close a bond that no position can be established or even thought of without its corresponding negation. So the concept of opposites represents to the conscious mind, he suggests, a reflection of the opposition that underlies all psychic energy. He's keen to establish that the opposites transcend any hierarchy of valuation. Neither opposite, this is important, I think, neither opposite is in itself superior to the other. It's not a hierarchical thing, although each can and probably will be seen as good or bad in certain situations. But as he says, instinct is not in itself bad any more than spirit is in itself good. Both can be both. And I think this really is a crucial point, because Jung is insisting that within a binary of opposites, each opposite is objectively neutral with respect to value. And this gets stated in the face of all cultural judgments, which invariably represent merely the perspective of collective consciousness at the time. So he says such evaluation or interpretation depends entirely upon the standpoint or state of the conscious mind. So, for example, if we're thinking about spirit and instinct, we can see at various points in the cultural development of the European West, for example, either of these notions has at different times been collectively evaluated as particularly positive and as strongly negative. But what Jung wants to emphasize is the closeness, the relation between the two, the closeness of the bond between them. And indeed, in this context, he often likes to utilize the French phrase, les extrêmes se touchent, the extremes touch each other. For example, here he says, the essence of the conscious mind is discrimination. It must, if it is to be aware of things, separate the opposites. In nature, the opposites seek one another, les extrêmes se touchent, and so it is in the unconscious, and particularly in the archetype of unity, the self. Here, as in the deity, the opposites cancel out. But as soon as the unconscious begins to manifest itself, they split asunder, as at the creation. For every act of dawning consciousness is a creative act, and it's from this psychological experience that all our cosmogonic symbols are derived. And the opposites se touchent because true opposites are never incommensurables. If they were, they could never unite. And Jung supports this contention with the reformulation of the same idea. He says all contrariety notwithstanding, they do show a constant propensity to union. And he supports this idea by citing Nicholas of Cusa's definition of God as a complexio oppositorum. And this notion of the union, this complexio or conjunction or marriage of opposites becomes very important for Jung, comes up again and again. And of course, it's very important in alchemy, which is an area that Jung gets seriously interested in as well. And this can only happen, this conjunctio, because there exists some kind of commensurability between the opposites. But the main point Jung wants to make is about the relativity of standpoint. So a culture which, he says, because of massed projections, is inordinately impressed by concrete or apparently concrete things and states, will naturally see in the instinctual drives the source of all reality. While a consciousness that finds itself in opposition to the instincts can so subordinate instinct to spirit that the most grotesque spiritual complications may arise out of what are undoubtedly biological happenings. So here again, Jung wants us to see that both these extreme viewpoints inevitably they're both one-sided, and therefore they create a distorted vision of reality. But he also wants to impress upon us that what lies behind this distortion is one-sidedness, the inevitable one-sidedness of a unifocal consciousness, which is incapable of achieving the breadth of vision, the wholeness of vision required to perceive the wholeness, which Cusa is pointing to with this term, complexio oppositorum. And individuation, the process of individuation, which is central to Jung psychology, is all about getting to the point where you can achieve this breadth of vision, incorporating, in a sense, both personalities, both opposites, into a binocular approach, which gains you a quantum leap in understanding if you can at that point see through, for example, through the eye of spirit and through the eye of instinct simultaneously. If you can do that, if you can get to that point, then an interaction between the opposites is created. And according to Jung, at that point, your psychological understanding becomes modified and deepened by this tension. And a tension like this is dynamic in a way which is completely denied to a single unifocal perspective, which accompanies a one-sided consciousness, whether it's looking through the lens of spirit or looking through the lens of instinct, doesn't matter, or any other of the opposites. So the whole point here is to get to the point where you bring the two into a relation which allows them to vibrate against each other in such a way that you move to a new way of seeing things. Now, for Jung, the primary psychological opposites, because he's working in psychology, are conscious and unconscious, which, incidentally, are commensurate in Jung, because for Jung, there exists in the depth of the unconscious various floating autonomous consciousnesses, which he likes to use an alchemical image of fish's eyes glowing in the dark. So in the depth of the unconscious, there are consciousnesses. And when he's talking about the ego, he says that at the very heart of the ego, which is the center of consciousness, there resides a place of the deepest unconsciousness. So, but because the unconscious is generally experienced as profoundly other to consciousness and the ego, and indeed as threatening to the ego for that reason, it gets perceived as taking up an oppositional stance. So an important principle for Jung when it comes to the way conscious and unconscious operate together is that of complementarity. And this is because Jung likes to see the psyche in some ways like the body as a self-regulating system. So he says there is no balance, no system of self-regulation without opposition. The psyche is just such a self-regulating system. So all this stuff with the opposites is working for the benefit of the system, the psychological system. And it does so by bringing conscious and unconscious into a relation of compensation with each other to achieve some kind of psychic balance. I mean, it should be said that this kind of psychic balance is only ever temporary, unfortunately. Of course, one then gets out of whack again, one becomes one-sided again, and then the whole process has to happen again and again and again in a rather interminable way. But nonetheless, the process is one of self-regulation. Yeah, as he says here, unconscious content must be made conscious so as to produce a tension of opposites without which no forward movement is possible. The conscious mind is on top, the shadow underneath, and just as high always longs for low and hot for cold, so all consciousness, perhaps without being aware of it, seeks its unconscious opposite, lacking which it is doomed to stagnation, congestion, and ossification. Yeah, so I skipped. Oh yeah, there it is. Yeah, and I mean, a good example of the way in which this works for Jung is, in fact, the dream. So, as he says here, if the conscious attitude to the life situation is in large degree one-sided, then the dream, the message from the unconscious, as it were, will take the opposite side. If the conscious has a position fairly near the middle, the dream is satisfied with variations. But if the conscious attitude is correct, adequate, then the dream coincides with and emphasizes this tendency, though without forfeiting its peculiar autonomy. Yeah, I mean, the latter doesn't happen that often in my experience. You're mostly dealing with the first of those three. But this compensatory relation itself is at the heart of what Jung calls the transcendent function. So this is something I think we should take a look at. So this, the transcendent function, as Jung calls it, is what happens when the conscious mind comes face to face, as he puts it, with the counterposition of the unconscious, its internal other. And Jung describes the process of coming to terms with the unconscious, as he puts it, as a true labor, which involves both action and suffering. He says the fiery conflict between conscious and unconscious can potentially be resolved when the transcendent function carries a uniting symbol forward into consciousness, thus guiding the ego as it attempts to integrate unconscious material. As a result of this, the ego shifts towards a less one-sided and more balanced midpoint of the personality. So it's a transition from one condition to a new one, in which momentarily at least the opposites are reconciled. Jung says the transcendent function manifests itself as a quality of conjoined opposites. And what emerges from this process, from this event, is what he calls a living third thing, something new and something hitherto unknown. Now, I think the way to think about this is to refer back to what I was saying about the binocularity. You've got a situation where the opposites are both there, and the tension is there. And if that can be held, Jung says, then eventually this what he calls this irrational event will occur, by which the transcendent function occurs, and that takes you to a new place, the third place, which is not identical to either of the original two opposites, but somehow partakes of both of them, and allows them both there to be there within it. So he says the shuttling to and fro of arguments and affects, which goes on in the build-up, as it were, to this transcendent function. They represent the transcendent function of opposites. The confrontation of the two positions generates a tension charged with energy, and that's what creates this living third thing, a movement out of the suspension between opposites, a living birth that leads to a new level of being, a new situation, which I would describe as kind of binocular. And as a result, you achieve a kind of three-dimensionality that you can't get from either of the opposites on their own, as it were. And this itself forms a basis for a process, not of dissolution, but of construction, in which thesis and antithesis both play their part. And in this way, it becomes a new content that governs the whole attitude, putting an end to the division, forcing the energy of the opposite into a common channel, in much the same way that Jung experienced it when he was wondering about science, or when he was wondering about psychiatry. Eventually, the standstill was overcome. Life flows on with renewed power towards new goals. He almost uses the same words here, and this is from his 1921 work, Psychological Types. He's almost using the same words here that he uses later in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, thinking back to those experiences. So it's clearly related to those experiences, I think. And as we already know, neither opposite is prioritized or privileged. Unconscious compensation is only effective when it cooperates with an integral consciousness. Assimilation is never a question of this or that, but always of this and that. However, the importance of the opposites for Jung is not only limited to this tension between conscious and unconscious, important, indeed central though that is in Jung psychology, because Jung actually sees this everywhere, even within consciousness. He says consciousness itself is composed of opposites, which can conflict with each other. So consciousness is structured according to the configuration of opposite forces inherent within it. Now, the place where he's talking about this is, we were just talking about typological types, psychological types, and it's in the realm of typology that we see this, because Jung identifies two different, as he calls it, attitude types, and that's what we all know as extroversion and introversion. Although one of these opposite orientations determines one's response to the objects of conscious experience, it also determines the compensatory action of the unconscious. Because where consciousness is extroverted, Jung says the unconscious is going to be introverted. And conversely, these opposites counterbalance one another. So Jung is talks about an unconscious attitude as well as a conscious attitude. Now, it gets even more complicated because he says there are four functions. So you've got a function of thinking, a function of feeling, a function of sensation, a function of intuition. These are all four different ways in which you can be in the world, in effect. You can approach the world through thinking, or you can approach the world through feeling, sensation, or intuition. But they're all different. But he also insists that these are paired up in opposites. So thinking is an opposite to feeling. If you're approaching the world through feeling, the last thing you can do is think. If you're approaching the world through thinking, he believes, then the last thing you can do is feel. It's almost impossible to do those two things at the same time, according to Jung. You may disagree. Similarly, he thinks the sensation and intuition are opposites in the same way. So everywhere you look in Jung, my point is, you're going to find these opposites. And again, it's always about avoiding one-sidedness. In typology, if you're hugely extroverted, you need to work on your introversion. You'll be very happy out there in the world, but rather unhappy in terms of your inner approach to yourself. That needs to be worked on, achieving more balance. If you're a strongly thinking person, then you need to work on your, as he calls it, inferior function, which will be feeling and so on. And the same goes for all the other functions. So in a way, it's very similar kind of notion in terms of the way this works. And as I say, I mean, this is stuff that you find everywhere you look in Jung. It's absolutely central to Jung psychology. And you find it in Psychological Types, 1921, which is basically the first work that Jung writes as a Jungian, in a sense, rather than before, when he was mixed up with Freud. And at the end of his life, his final great work is he is entitled Mysterium Conjunctionis. It's a work about alchemy mainly, but he describes it. The subtitle he gives it is an inquiry into the separation and synthesis of psychic opposites. So this problem of opposites, it dominates his work. And I think we should see it as part of the dialogue he was very conscious of conducting with his predecessors. He overtly sees himself as part of what he calls an aurea catena, a golden chain, which links him back to, all the way back to Heraclitus, via Eckhart, Nicholas of Cusa, Bruno, Boehme, Goethe, the alchemists, Nietzsche, others. But this chain also goes forward towards his work with his collaborator Wolfgang Pauli in quantum physics and on to synchronicity and so on. So, I mean, I've no doubt that Jung would have been delighted in all the ideas that you've been presented with in this series of talks. But I'm certain that all these ideas about dualities and the opposites were grounded for Jung in his own visceral experience of possessing the two personalities. And that, I think, is what made it, enabled him to, for these ideas, as it were, to transcend the intellectual and become a lived reality. And of course, that is really what his psychology is all about, enabling that experience for anyone. Okay, I think I will stop there. That's me done, basically. So I'll stop share. Yeah, so we've got a fair bit of time to talk about anything at all which has come out of any of those ideas. So James, how do you want to conduct this question and answer?
Well, first of all, I'd just like to thank you so much, Mark, for your wonderful lecture and introducing us to a new Jung, which I personally didn't know about, his two personalities, but so thank you for bringing them forwards. Regarding Q&A, I am very happy to moderate this for you. We can use the raise your hand functions if anyone would like to ask a question, and I can call out your name. And otherwise, if it makes you feel more comfortable, you can write your question in the chat and I can read it out. We already have one hand up. Donna, if you'd like to come in.
Yes, thank you. It was a wonderful talk. I love Carl Jung, and I wanted to ask you what went on in the last administration in the United States, and phenomena such as QAnon. You know, if you're familiar with that, the QAnon people, all this seemed right out of Jung and the shadow. And I thought of the book, The Undiscovered Self. I think that was the name of it years ago, and I reread it. And I thought, my gosh, this is really happening. This is people, you know, they haven't assimilated their shadow and they're projecting it, all kinds of crazy stuff. And I just wonder if you could comment on that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Donna. Yes, well, yeah, I'm not sure I have anything very deep to contribute to the analysis of QAnon, but I do think that I think that a Jungian approach can possibly help, because, as you say, what we seem to be dealing with is some very shadowy, very irrational stuff, which it's easy, I think, for a lot of us to kind of dismiss as bonkers, mad, and you know, how could anyone believe such nonsense and so on. But obviously that doesn't get us very far in terms of working out what on earth's going on, and that really matters when these forces, you know, become as important as they seem to be becoming in the States at the moment. I'm sorry to say. So I think that really, I mean, what that brings me on to, I think, is thinking that, I mean, obviously Jung's psychology is very much about and related to the psychology of the individual, and his notion of individuation and everything that I've been talking about is very much directed towards the kind of work that an individual can do, you know, in conjunction with an analyst, maybe, but anyway, I mean, it can be done, and it's intrapsychic work. But I think it is actually quite useful sometimes to think about, you know, if we think about Jung's idea of individuation, for example, you know, if we apply that notion and everything that goes with it in terms of what I've said about the opposites and in terms of one-sidedness and so on, if we apply that on a sort of broader scale, if you like, if we apply it to a group, a culture, a collective, I think all these things can individuate and need to individuate. They need to change. They need to be alive. Any democracy, any you know, sort of living culture needs to stay alive by change and moving forward. And of course, that also means that any of these things can become one-sided and has a tendency, we all have a tendency as individuals to become one-sided, but so do cultures, and so do political organizations, and so on. It happens all the time. And of course, what happens when that happens? Well, something is going to come out of the shadow and draw your attention to the problem. And at that point, we should jolly well pay attention to it. And it's not good enough to say, well, that's just a load of old nonsense, let's fight it, because we need to listen to what's going on behind it. There's something going on there which is important, and it may be dressed up in a load of fascist nonsense, but as we know from history, fascist nonsense has a habit of becoming pretty dangerous if we don't take note of what's going on behind it. Now, as I say, I haven't got an instant analysis for what's going on behind it. I wish I did. I'd be writing that book right now. But I think that there's something of that sort going on. And yeah, I mean, I don't know if any of you have ideas about that, but I'd be interested to hear them. But I think that's the kind of psychological work that needs to be done.
Thank you, Donna, for your question. I can see we have, sorry. So I can see we have some questions from the chat. The first one comes from David, who asks, I'm fascinated with Jung's concepts coming alive in the midst of Nazism and World War II. Could you comment on that?
I'm not sure exactly what is meant. Can we ask David to clarify what he means exactly? Because I'm not sure what he's referring to, really.
David, would you like to come in, or would you like me to sort of? I think what he's trying to ask, if I interpreted the question well, is how did World War II and the Nazi culture that he was exposed to, how could that have influenced his work in any way?
Right. I mean, this is a controversial topic, I have to say, because Jung, as many of you probably know, I mean, Jung got into a bit of trouble in the 1930s, and it's the shadow of that has hung around Jungian psychology ever since. And in effect, what he did, and actually this is quite interesting, I think, from this point of view, because what in my view is that he made a mistake, and what he did, I mean, in effect, what he did was he looked at Nazism, the beginnings of Nazism, right in the very beginnings, and he thought that although, however unpleasant it looked, it might represent a sort of fresh new shoot in some of the ways that I've been talking about, the sort of complementary stuff, this compensatory stuff that tends to come in if one gets one-sided. Now, Jung was highly critical of the kind of established Western culture, and he felt that it was one-sidedly rational and one-sidedly rather intellectual and so on. And he therefore was not surprised when he saw what he thought was a kind of irrational thing coming into being in the form of the Nazis and fascism generally, I suppose. But I think what he did when he saw that was he started talking, and this is one of the ways that Jung liked to talk. He started talking mythologically. So his explanation, basically, of what Nazism was about was that it was a resurgence of the Germanic god Wotan, and all the forces which had been sort of kept under, repressed through centuries of Christianity, were now emerging and coming up. And he thought, I think, at that stage that as I say, however unpleasant that might be, it was necessary in some way, or it might be necessary to, again, bring things back into balance. I think he got that wrong, and I think he realized later that he got it very wrong. But I think part of the problem was this, that he rather one-sidedly prioritized a sort of mythological interpretation of what was happening. And I think if he'd looked more closely at the economic, political realities of that time, he would have come up with a far more interesting analysis of what was going on, and one that would have enabled him to be rather more critical, I think, at that point than he seemed to be able to be. Because, and again, if you bring, you know, on the one hand, the kind of archetypal, the mythological, if you bring that into tension with its opposite, which might well, we could think of as a kind of political, sociological, analytical approach to the situation, the historical approach, if we bring those two things into tension with each other, then something interesting might happen. We actually might get a rather useful kind of analysis, which is exactly the kind of thing that I've got in mind when I'm talking about the QAnon developments in America. I think if one does that, you know, brings into play, because obviously there are historical realities and political realities and economic realities, apart from anything else, which matter. Those things do matter, but we can bring that into play with an archetypal, mythological way of seeing things, and then something quite interesting could happen. But I think Jung made a mistake there by not doing that, and as a result, he got into trouble, quite rightly. And you know, eventually he changed his mind and decided the Nazis were a terrible thing, but it was a bit too late for a lot of people, unfortunately. Yeah, so I don't know if that answers the question, but that's my response to it.
I feel like it does. Thank you, Mark, and of course, thank you, David, for asking. Next, we have a few more hands up. We'll go to Edwin.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation, Mark. It was excellent. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about his work with Pauli, particularly the implications of discoveries of quantum physics. And these days, as research and so on has been going on in many fields, we talk about consciousness as fundamental, that actually it was mind that creates matter, and so on. I wonder what Jung's position or thoughts would be about that possibility.
Yes. Thank you. It's an excellent question, and one that I have to say, I don't feel entirely equipped to answer. It's not my kind of area of expertise. I understand that Professor Roderick Mayne, who's my colleague at Essex, has attended and talked about this stuff in the past. But I wish he were here now to answer your question, to be honest. But yeah, I to be honest, yeah, as I say, I mean, I think there are probably people here who might have, and maybe you, Edwin, have some ideas about this, which I personally would like to hear, because I mean, clearly, I mean, this is difficult stuff, basically. Anything that involves quantum physics, you know, as they say, if you think you understand it, you don't. So, you know, that's pretty well my position. So I don't feel like, I mean, synchronicity, I can say a little bit about that, because it seems to me that the opposites that synchronicity, one of the opposites, the pair of opposites that synchronicity brings into play is that of the inner world and the outer world. And that really matters in my work as a psychoanalyst, because these synchronicities happen and they're meaningful, and they make it, and there's clearly an indication, they're clearly pointing the way in which the outer world, you know, in the classic example, Jung was talking to a patient, and she'd had a dream of a scarab beetle, and this woman was he says, describes her as ultra rational, completely, you know, the whole therapy was stuck, nothing could move forward. She seemed to be stuck in this very rational world. But anyway, she'd had this dream of the scarab beetle, and Jung was sitting there thinking, well, you know, how am I going to deal with this? And then there was a tap at the window, And Jung goes to the window and opens it, and in flies a beetle, which looks very much like a scarab. It's a form of scarab beetle. And he says, here's your scarab beetle. And he hands it over to her. And at that point, he says, she undergoes, a moment of insight happens. Her rational shell breaks, and there's a moment of, she understands in a way that she hadn't before. There's a, it's a transcendent function again. It moves her forward to a new place where she can see things in a new way. Now that's the way synchronicities work in practice. And what's fascinating about that is that the outer world, in some way that is inexplicable to me at least, in some way is clearly part of the same universe, part of, there's a clear relation between the scarab tapping on the window and the dream and what's going on in the room between the two of them. And Jung gets to the point where he likes to talk about this idea of what he calls the unus mundus, the one single world. And I think what he means by that, among other things, is that the world of going on inside my psyche is the same world as what's going on out there in the world, and the beetle is part of that, and so is us sitting in the room together, and so is, all these things are in a sense part of the same reality, in a way which conventional Western science has struggled with expressing and understanding, and therefore has sort of failed to recognize, but a way in which I think, and here I'm moving into the area that I don't understand, but that I think Jung and Pauli seem to, where they're getting to is the notion that quantum physics somehow gives us an insight into, or the understanding of quantum physics gives us an insight into the way in which that operates. Yes. I can't go any further than that because I don't get that bit. Maybe, is there anything that you wanted to say about it, Edwin?
Well, yes, if I could just say one comment. Actually, I've just written a book on this. So
right. Excellent.
It's called Become Conscious of Wholeness. But I think relating my question to the framework that you so excellently presented, see, I see personality 1 as this surface, this outer world, right? Yes. And then personality 2 is this inner world of quantum mechanics, where we have non-locality, quantum entanglement, and so on. And that's where the whole dream world and everything. And you're right, as unus mundus, they are all one. That is wholeness. And that is what I think we need to be striving for. So thank you very much.
No, that's very helpful. Thank you. Because now I've got a nice picture of kind of Newtonian physics as personality number 1 and physics personality number 2. That's great. That's very helpful. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Edwin, for coming in and for contributing. We'll go next to Hugh.
Hi, Hugh.
Oh, you're just muted at the moment, Hugh.
I was, yes, I was just absorbed with something else. I'm sorry, I'm looking at the sign about the host has spotlighted your video for everyone. And unmute myself. All right. I was interested in how far your research is running in parallel with McGilchrist's research on the brain's hemispheres. I kept thinking of very direct parallels, both in terminology and actual research insights. I'd be very interested in any comment you might make on that. And rather more naughtily, I did wonder whether the mother-daughter team of Myers and Briggs, in your view, served Jung's insights well in bringing them into the management world's most popular personality inventory, or whether it's really been a travesty.
Yes. Okay. Well, I'll answer both questions. So the first question, yes. I mean, I absolutely know where you're coming from when you say that about the McGilchrist's work and his book, The Master and His Emissary. It's a difficult one, this, because I haven't quite worked out how Jung's ideas, as I've described them, as I understand them, speak to exactly speak to what McGilchrist is saying. And yet it's so very striking, as you've described, that they're clearly talking about the same thing in some way. And I mean, I had this experience. I went to a talk by Ian McGilchrist, and at the end, I was just beginning the research into my book at the time, so I brought up this question of Jung and two personalities and so on, and in the hope that he would sort of put me out of my misery and show me the truth. But unfortunately, he didn't seem to understand. He didn't seem to get, I mean, he could clearly see, I mean, he was talking to an audience of Jungians, so he knows perfectly well that there is an important connection between his research and his book and Jung, that we're going to somehow get him in a way that I think he realizes that. But having said that, the exact way in which, and this is a problem of different languages, I think. Because although his book is clearly very wide-ranging, it's really very fundamentally based in neuroscience, really, and the brain, brain science anyway. And it's quite hard to work out how to get these different disciplines to talk to each other, because Jungian psychology talks in a certain way, and brain science talks in a certain way, but yeah, I mean, there's no question that, I mean, this is something that I continue to struggle with. Basically, there's no question they're talking about the same thing in some way. And I mean, one of the things that does come out, I will say, this is something I was thinking about the other day, is that there's a tendency to fall into thinking that that there's a kind of symmetry or equality to the opposites somehow in Jung. And I think what the Masters in Emissary really brings home is the sort of lack of symmetry, actually, because it's quite clear that the two, and I think you get this in terms of the ego and the self, and you get it in terms of personality number one and personality number two as well. I think that they're not equal somehow. I think but they still need to be together, is the point. They still need to work through each other. Neither will work on its own. And that's the case with left brain and right brain as well, clearly. So I think that's the key point. Again, it's the emphasis is on the relationship between the two, the way in which they work together. And that's what I get very strongly from his book. But yeah, I mean, I'll keep reading it and keep going back to it. And I mean, do you have any ideas about that?
I wouldn't care to venture them. I've only just acquired his new 2-volume work,
right?
They take if the first book was wide-ranging, this most recent volume is about the most wide-ranging I can possibly have come across. But
yes, he's nothing if not ambitious in his scope. That's for sure.
Indeed.
Yeah. But as to your second question, I know actually I've managed to avoid having any real encounter with Myers-Briggs. And I think I'm going to keep it that way, because my opinion is, yes, that it is actually a bit of a travesty of Jung's writings on typology. And in many ways, and this may not be entirely their fault, but certainly the ways in which Myers-Briggs gets used in the world, I think is almost directly opposite to the way in which Jung would have liked his writings on typology to be used. Yes, so I think there's a real conflict between the two there. And in effect, I mean, the main difference, I think, is that Jung's emphasis in his work on typology is always about the moving towards the transcendent function, which means bringing into play the inferior. It's always about that. Always about that. And whereas what dominates Myers-Briggs and so on is the interest in the superior function, in other words, consciousness. So Jung is much more interested in the unconscious and what it has to offer, whereas Myers-Briggs and all those who use it on the whole are far more interested in the way one, consciously present oneself. I mean, I may be doing it a disservice, but I slightly doubt it.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting, very helpful.
Thank you,
Thank you
for coming in. We'll next go to Eduardo.
Yes, thank you very much. I would like just to offer a suggestion about McGilchrist and Jung. I'm a Jungian, and I've been studying McGilchrist for a while and trying to correlate what they are doing. And my only conclusion is that they both are saying the right things according to their times and according to the level of knowledge at their times. Jung is, like you said, extremely focused on the psyche, on the psychology side, and you can see a tremendous amount of levels of complementarities. If you do the psyche analysis, the ego, the shadow, the anima, the animus, the eros, the logos, it's a like 7 or 8 levels of different complementarities of opposites. But Jung never had an opportunity to recognize the two hemispheres of the brain. He was talking about a single unit. And if you follow the left and right brain, you can just put another level of complementarity. You have all of the psyche that Jung is bringing up into McGilchrist's left and right brain, and you almost have like 2 consciousness, like you started with, 2 different consciousness, each one with all of their other set of complementarities in the psyche. So to me, they are complementary, McGilchrist and Jung. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Eduardo. That is very helpful. I mean, it occurs to me that, I mean, one of the difficulties I have, I mean, I was talking about the thing about different languages, and one of the things that I think is problematic sometimes when bringing different disciplines into conversation with each other is that there can be a tendency to reduce one to the other. And I think that's the opposite of what Jung wants to do. His Jung's kind of transdisciplinary work doesn't do that. I mean, at its best, it certainly doesn't do that. But you can find yourself reading stuff about neuroscience and about brain science, which has a tendency to reduce stuff to, so it's all, you don't need to know, the spirit and whatever, never mind that, it's this bit of the brain, that kind of approach is clearly reductive and not, utterly unhelpful, I think. Now, McGilchrist never ever gives it that, absolutely not. So I wouldn't ever accuse McGilchrist of doing that, quite the contrary. McGilchrist is very aware of the perils of reduction, I think.
Yeah.
But I think it's important for us to remember that what we're doing is we're comparing different. Yeah, I mean, it's different ways to, I mean, if it is the unus mundus, then the hemispheres of the brain are again part of that unus mundus and will operate in the same way as everything else. So it works on that level, I think. Yeah, there was something else I wanted to say. What was it? Oh yeah, I think another interesting thing. I mean, a little bit, which I am particularly interested in affect and emotion, because I think this is I mean, Jung does put emphasis on it, but it's not especially early on. But later on, he gets a little bit less emphasis. But I think it's always central to Jung, actually, the importance of affect. And what he does do is, Jung does do, is talk, when he does talk about the brain, he talks about the reptilian brain, which is the very, very most primitive early part of the brain, as it were. And it seems that affect and emotion that's basically where where it resides. So I think that adds an interesting kind of third aspect to this. We have the 2 dimensions, the two parts of the brain, but we also have this other reptilian aspect that somehow infuses the whole thing with affect and emotion, and that seems crucially important too. And I haven't got much to say about it. I just think it's really interesting.
Thank you, Eduardo, for coming in. Next, we'll go to Abelardo.
Thank you so much, Mark. Very stimulating conversation. Before I make my question, I just want to comment that in my understanding of McCleary's hypothesis about the triune brain, emotion and affect comes in the early mammalian brain, not the reptilian.
Oh, okay, right. I got that wrong. But yeah, but it's not. It's earlier than the frontal lobes, isn't it?
Oh yeah. Oh. The reptilian is very much linked to instinct and yeah.
Okay, thank
you. Well, I'm not a Jungian, but I am a psychologist and quite sympathetic to Buddhism. I do know that from Buddha, that Jung has very far-ranging interest and quest in different traditions. Some Asian, where you mentioned his last work, the alchemist tradition of the Middle Ages and so on. And it seems to me that there might be some sort of similarity. It's very tempting with Jung to as you presented, to think in terms of analogies, isn't it? Of course, has the danger of reading into it something that might not be there. But in Buddhism, as you might be familiar, a very important area is the concepts of conventional truth, the two truths, conventional truth and ultimate truth. And these are two modes of knowing, two modes of investigating. It's actually one reality, but from the point of view of one's cognitive approach to the reality, the conventional truth is everything that we take as real. It's the ego. And the ultimate reality is the emptiness of that, which we take as real. But emptiness doesn't mean nothingness. It just means that what we take to be absolutely real is it's empty of being isolated or being a separate self. It's interconnected with all. So it's a very fundamental polarity in Buddhism. So do you think that he might have investigated that? I know he investigated into Taoism, I Ching, and things like that, but
yeah, exactly. Thank you very much for that question. Yeah, because I wasn't. I mean, I'm not a Buddhist, and I don't know much about Buddhism. But that's very. Is that the case in all traditions of Buddhism, that those two versions of truth, as it were, are central?
Very central. Yes.
Yes.
That's
I would
really,
say so.
really useful, because that, as you say, I mean, of course, it's easy to fall into analogies, but that does feel relevant. And presumably, again, I mean, this would be the important thing. The point is not that one is true and the other one is false. They are both true in their way. Is that the case? Is that what Buddhism holds?
In order to be able to live in this world of phenomena, but which is part of samsara, we need to have conventional ways of thinking and relating. But if we don't want to be trapped in samsara, which is very limiting, if we want to channel our spiritual aspirations and get freedom, we have to develop the mind so that we can see the relative nature of that, but it's very difficult. One cannot express in words and concepts what's that ultimate reality is about. It's a direct perception. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Right. But as you say, I mean, so you do need both, in the sense that you in order to be in the world, you need to live in it in a kind of day-to-day way, an ordinary way.
You don't need to have consciousness of the ultimate reality to be in the world. In fact, most people do not.
No, I mean the other way around.
Kind of,
I meant the other way around. You need ordinary, normal kind of consciousness in order to be in the world. But ideally, you would have the other one kind of there. The two would be in tandem, as it were. The two would be both present.
Yes, because the conventional conception of the world, our daily perception of the world, is what in Buddhism is considered the main source of all our sufferings and afflictions. It's, there are three main poisons in Buddhism of the mind: ignorance or delusion, so believing that things are absolutely real and substantial and permanent, non-changing. Then there's desire, want to cling, and then it's opposite, aversion. Life is a continuous struggle between attraction, clinging, and aversion. And unless we open the mind and realize that, and also it's also that this is the reality of the way things are, that our ego is not substantially real, although we believe it is. And when we create the ego, we believe in the other. And so, so I think
I get the picture. I mean, I think that I think there is something there. I think we're talking about the same thing in some ways, but obviously it's also true, and Jung emphasizes this, that different cultures, different times, different that there are different ways of being in the world which emphasize, in other words, there are certain one-sidednesses that come into play if you're in the West, which sometimes in the East you're going to get different one-sidednesses, and that will show up in the form of the religion and indeed in the whole culture. But behind that, we're dealing with the same. So the important thing, I think, is the tension between the two, rather than getting stuck. I mean, again, it's sort of not getting attached. We don't want to get attached to one particular way of understanding any of this, because behind that, because in a way the point is not to be attached to it, to get behind it.
Exactly the point.
Yes, good. Thank you very much, Abelardo. That's
yeah.
I mean, actually, let me just say that of course, and this is something I meant to mention in the talk but never got around to, which is that, of course, you're quite right. Jung was interested in Eastern religion, and he was, including Buddhism, but he was also interested in Taoism, as you mentioned. And of course, in Taoism, the whole the yin yang and the whole tension of opposites is a huge, hugely important aspect of that particular religion. So I think Jung was very drawn to it for that very reason. Yeah.
Great.
So did he ever?
Sorry, I just want to interrupt, just because I can see there's two more hands up. Okay. We should really move on. We can come back to it if we've got time anyway. We'll go next to Albertina.
Okay. So while I am listening to you, I become willing to be interactive and say something about ultimate reality of the last person. But see, time is short, and it's better I skip that. I sort of help understand the ultimate reality, and I think this is a better way. So I fell head over heels in love with Mark Verne. And it's curious because I didn't expect anything sort of, you see, because when I was a teenager, now until 22 years old, I was able to read both scientific issues and literature in 3 languages, French, German, 4 languages, French, German, Portuguese, and English. And then I had a call when I was 17 to become an architect, and I was preparing to become a doctor. And imagine what happens to you when this happens. And it was very anguishing. And then this story, and also I fell in love with Jung when I was a teenager. And I didn't like Freud at all. And I'm really impressed about your talk. Really, I didn't expect you to be so focused, so wonderful. And what you told about the German God, I found even more fascinating. Because you see, it's very easy to say, it's interesting. Putin now is going to be demonized. And then GOP is saying, no apologies, no place for the guy here, even Trump. And I'm delighted because the good always wins. And it's going to be very focused. And then I tried to, this ended up leading me to suicide because my psychologist would tell me to deal with transactional analysis and to be very positive. And then my mother was Marxist. Oh, and then I like that. You see, just do what you want. Okay, but life is not like that. And then I ended up trying to commit suicide when I was 22 years old because I could not put up with the biomedical sciences and I was not an artist. I didn't know how to write. And to study architecture, impossible. You have the test, you need to start drawing. But when I was 22 years old, I was sort of disappointed with my biomedical studies, but I was really into, I was really like an artist already. And then I tried to commit suicide and I suffered from strong hallucinations for 11 years, going through the stress of studying architecture as a scientist and having to face really old-fashioned studies. For example, we had to go for a history test where we had to draw by memory the details of the tombs of the pharaohs. Imagine if a scientist would accept this. It was insane. And then coming back to Mark Vernon, I always felt curious about Blake, but see, when I tried to commit suicide, I awakened Kundalini, and I couldn't read any. I could read scientific texts, but not literature anymore. I was not at all interested in literature.
Sorry,
and then I always wanted to read Blake. No, I'm going to be objective now, okay? So I want to read Blake, and I never. And then, I got fascinated by Blake. And then I think no, really, I'm going to say something nice now. I think James Joyce is the perfect continuity to Blake. And I was able to read James Joyce when I was 33 years old. Why? Because it was like music. Each line was like music. It's not necessary to have memory to remember what you read before. And now I am fascinated because the psychiatrist Anil Seth is putting forward, is reality a controlled hallucination? So what do you think about that?
What do I think about that? Well, yeah, that's quite an idea, isn't it? Yeah, I don't know what I think about that, really. I think that's Yeah, reality and hallucination. Well, I mean, it's not really hallucination, is it? Because hallucination would mean that it's unreal, whereas I think what we're talking about is a way of being in touch with the world, which is real, but which is getting behind the sort of the surface of things, and seeing, somehow sensing the wholeness of things. And that's not really a hallucination. It's the truth, but it's a different truth from the truth of, as we were saying, the truth of the everyday and the objects and you know, me being here and you being there. It's a connected world, which so I'm not sure I would use the word hallucination, but yeah, it's pretty mind blowing. That's for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, and responding this is a sign. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Albertini.
Next we'll go, well, as a returning from last week, Dave. Oh, still unmuted. Does this help you, Dave? Oh, there we go.
There. Yes, all my icons disappeared, but you can hear me now.
We can, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. So thank you very much for your talk. It was really interesting to hear so much about Jung, and he has such wonderful, deeply colorful, embodied, and what would we call them? Vivid, felt perceptions of things. So what I was wondering about is Jung, and energy comes from the tension of opposites. Now it seems that individuation comes from the unification of opposites, bringing them to unity. So then the question would follow, does Jung say anything about an energy which comes from the ending of oppositions?
When you say the ending of oppositions, what do you mean?
That there are no opposites anymore. There are only complementarities. That perception. I'm just, you know, I'm not a Jung scholar, but yeah, it seems to me that individuation has to do with the ending of oppositions. Opposites are opposed. They're in opposition in some way or other. You know, there's the one, there's the other. And so I just wondered then if in the ending of oppositions, you know, of opposites, if there's an energy, because apparently there's an energy in the tension, right?
Yes.
Yeah. It would seem to me, and I'm wondering what Jung would say, that in the ending of oppositions, that, you know, in which things become complementary, is there a different energy or a different kind of energy? Does he say anything about that?
Yes, no, I don't. I'm not sure he does, but I mean, you've drawn attention to quite an interesting question, I think, which is that because there are two ways, kind of two, it would be two, I suppose. There are two ways to look at this. Because one, as you say, one concentrates on the tension of opposites, and in a way, the third thing comes out of the tension of opposites. But the other way of looking at it is to concentrate on the idea of the unification of opposites. And you can find both of these ideas in Jung when he talks about the transcendent function and about the whole thing. But I think one can kind of have one's cake and eat it, really, because I think what happens is there is a tension, and the tension, I mean, this matters when you're, I don't know if anybody is interested in Hegel's dialectic, but Hegel is talking about something not entirely dissimilar to what Jung's talking about, but in my opinion, it's quite different. And the difference is that in Jung, the separateness of and tension of the opposites doesn't disappear in the new thing. I don't think it's completely dissolved into you know, so that I don't think you get to a point where there's no opposition, where the tension goes completely. It's just that it's somehow contained within the new dispensation, as it were, the new way you can see things. So it's a bit, you know, so again, you know, coming back to the image of binocularity, you're still seeing through two different eyes. It's just that what goes on between the vision and the two eyes is that a three-dimensional image is achieved, but you're still looking through two different eyes. That doesn't stop. You don't suddenly develop one eye, as it were. And I think that's the way I think of the process that Jung's talking about. But it's also the case that once the third is achieved, as it were, once the new perspective is achieved, it immediately, or almost immediately, comes into play with some other new opposite. So there's never a point where the opposites are totally resolved, you know, because the way the world is, there's always something new to kind of, you're always veering off course one way or the other, and so the thing has to come in from the outside again. So I don't know if that helps, but that's my kind of reading of the situation.
Yeah. Okay. Very interesting. Okay. I was wondering, if Jung had anything to say about energies in that particular context.
Right.
No.
Yes, I think. I mean,
kind of energy.
I don't think he does. No, and I think that actually what he has to say about psychic energy tends to be quite early. He really doesn't. He talks less about psychic energy later on, and and I think it gets subsumed into an overall notion of the kind of movement of the psyche and the general aliveness of the psyche is what he's getting at, rather than a specific notion of energy, I think. So it's just being alive, really.
Yeah, well, that's clear then. You know, it brings with it a liveliness, which is an energy which is maybe not focused in the same way as attention directs it.
Yes,
I think that's clear. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave, for coming in. So we'll take one more question, and it does come from the chat, this one. So I'll read that out for you. This is in regards to the shadow, which appears to be sort of some aspect of duality in Jungian psychology. So I just wanted you to comment on that, and also in context with Jung's two personalities.
Okay, yes. So the notion of the shadow, I mean, there's a sort of limited aspect of the shadow, which is what we think of as being the negative. But the true shadow for Jung is anything which is kind of out of consciousness, really. So there's a sense in which anything unconscious it can be described as shadow, because that means that we constantly require shadow. Shadow is what we you know, in a way it comes back to this question of of what gets left out. It's the shadow is what is left out from the ego is constantly trying to create a kind of stable, safe kind of realm in which to live and to work. But of course, life's not like that. And it has to, in order to do that, it has to exclude all kinds of stuff. And so the stuff that gets excluded is the shadow, in effect. And it's the shadow in that dream, you know, the dark figure coming up behind Jung, you know, that was the shadow cast from consciousness. So if you've got consciousness, you're always going to have shadow. In terms of the two personalities, I think looked at from this broader sense, I think personality number two, and certainly that's what Jung implies when he talks about that dream, is that personality number two is in some sense the shadow cast from personality number one. But I mean, I don't think we want to get too stuck on that. The point is that the two are so intimately related and complementary to each other. I think that's the real point. And so ego and shadow are always like that. And you can't have ego without shadow. You can't have shadow without ego. The two go together, really. And you can never escape shadow. There will always be a new form of shadow. So you may think you've come to terms with your greed, say, or your anger, but it'll turn up in some new form to annoy you, just out of your blind spot, as it were. That's the message that Jung has for us, sadly, and there's no escape from it. So there it is.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Mark, and thank you for the person who asked the question. So we're just over the hour, so I was wondering, Mark, if you have any final remarks for us before we close.
Oh, I don't think so. I mean, it's been very stimulating, very interesting talking to you all. Thank you very much for your questions and reflections. I genuinely, I mean, that is what people always say, but I genuinely do learn more from that than I do from spouting the stuff that I've already know inside out. So that doesn't get me anywhere, but I do get something from listening to your responses and thinking about it later. So thank you, and I'll look at the chat and see what's there, because I know there'll be stuff there that will be of interest. So I'll look forward to that. So yeah, thank you all for being here, really.
Great. Well, I think it's been wonderful.
Thank you, James. Yeah.
It's been wonderful to have you, Mark, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. And of course, thank you all to the audience, to everyone who's participated with their questions, with the chat, or just by being here. I'd just like to hope to see you all tomorrow, where we're going to have a discussion between the president of the Pari Center, Shantina Sabadini, and scholar Mauro Bergonzi, who will discuss dualities and non-dualities. In the meantime, you can contact us on our website, social media, or email at james@paricenter.com to contact me, or eleanor@paricenter.com to contact Eleanor. Thank you all again, Mark. Thank you all again, and we'll see you again soon here at the Pari Center.